President, I didn't get a chance to hear the distinguished Democratic leader's remarks. Chairman Hatch and I were in the Senate Finance Committee. We managed to pass by an overwhelming bipartisan vote the Children's Health Insurance Program, a vital program for 9 million kids. So that's a bit of good news that that important legislation is advancing. But I know that the Democratic leader has touched on a number of very important issues, particularly some of these comments made by top advisors to the president with respect to taxes. I was struck by the fact that Mr. Gary Cohn, president's top economic advisor, said last week that middle-class folks were going to get $1,000 in tax relief. Set aside the fact that that doesn't look true for a number of middle-class folks who have kids, but I'm struck with the comment that followed. Mr. Cohn said not only are middle-class families going to get $1,000 worth of tax relief, but they would be able to go buy a car or remodel their kitchen. And you just ask yourself, that kind of tax cut, you'd be buying a very small car or remodeling a very small kitchen. You know, the fact is, that's not, in my view, a comment that reflects a real understanding of what middle-class folks in America are going through. I don't see very many of them buying a car for $1,000, remodeling their kitchen for $1,000. And that comment was accompanied by the comments of Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who not only said a couple of days ago that tax cuts would pay for themselves, a statement that was contradicted by Republican economists yesterday in the Senate Finance Committee. Not only did he say that tax cuts would pay for themselves, he said that there'd be something like $1 trillion left over. So Mr. Mnuchin continues to make the case that there is somehow a magical growth fairy here in the American economy that nobody else knows about, including Republican economists. I'm one who believes that behavior does matter, and I think, and I'm going to talk about a bipartisan approach to taxes in a minute, a responsible bipartisan approach to taxes, not one that helps the 1% or creates a huge new deficit or that kind of thing. I think that you will generate some revenue. Doug Elmendorf, when he was head of the budget office, said that, but it is not going to generate hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. In the case of what Mr. Mnuchin is talking about, something like $2 trillion, and there is no economic support for that. So you've got the president's economic team and their top advisors trying to defend the indefensible, and I'll go into that more a little bit later today. But right now, I think it's important that we have a response that I'm going to deliver to the distinguished majority whip, who's a member of the Finance Committee, who made some comparisons between the Republican plan and the bipartisan legislation that I wrote after months and months of hard work with two of our former Republican colleagues, Senator Gregg and Senator Coates. Senator Coates, now a member of President Trump's cabinet. Now, the comparison that somehow the Republican plan is like the bipartisan approach I wrote, these extreme ideas in the Republican plan, is like the approach that I wrote that was bipartisan, isn't just a bit of a stretch. It isn't just a little off base. There is absolutely no comparison none, between the bipartisan proposal and the extreme Republican plan. The distinguished majority whip, in my view, offered a complete and total misrepresentation of what the two proposals are all about, and I'm going to illustrate this in two ways. First, with respect to the policy. The Republican tax cut framework greenlights the entire wish list for major multinational corporations and the wealthy. There's a massive corporate tax cut that overwhelmingly benefits shareholders. When it comes to international taxes, there's a pure territorial system with barely a nod to the kind of tough rules that are needed to protect workers and the middle-class folks who are the center of our tax base. There is in the Republican plan a brand new pass-through loophole. It's as big as the Grand Canyon of loopholes in the Republican tax proposal that invites tax cheats to skip out on paying their fair share to Social Security and Medicare. The Republican plan eliminates the estate tax, which today only touches estates worth more than $11 million or $5.5 million for a single individual. The top income tax rate goes down, the bottom income tax rate goes up. When you do the math on what Republicans have on offer, you're looking at upwards of $4 or $5 or $6 trillion in tax giveaways to the most fortunate. It's a different story under the Republican proposal. If you're middle class, you probably got a lot of unanswered questions. All you know right now is it's virtually guaranteed that in order to pay for the giveaways to the wealthy and the corporations, current middle-class tax breaks are going to be on the chopping block. The personal exemption, incentives for retirement savings, education, and home ownership, to name just a few. And everything we know is when you set up these kind of extreme approaches, when you raid the parts of the tax code that are about helping the middle class, that are a giveaway to those at the top, what you see is the middle class getting hurt. And instead of tripling the standard deduction, which is what we did in our bipartisan bill, the Trump people double it, but then they take away the personal exemptions for working class folks. So unlike our proposal, where the middle class can count on hundreds and hundreds of dollars in their paychecks, when you triple the standard deduction, under the Republican proposal, they giveth with one hand by doubling the standard deduction, take it away on the other hand by eliminating the personal exemptions. And so you have a very stark difference between what the bipartisan proposal that I offered with particularly Senator Coates, a member of the President's cabinet, and what the Republican extreme plan is all about. The bottom line is the Republican plan seeks to raid those parts of our tax code that are all about the middle class, and they're doing it to pay for the giveaway to those folks at the top. That's not what we did in the bipartisan plan at all. Any middle-class person can sit at their kitchen table and look at the bipartisan plan that I was involved with and see how the middle class wins. They got hundreds and hundreds of dollars more in every paycheck by tripling the standard deduction, and they can see how they, as middle-class folks, say making $70,000 and have a couple of children, how they lose under the Trump proposal. Now, there are other differences between our bipartisan plan and what the Big Six and the Trump administration wants. The bipartisan plan was scored as revenue neutral by authoritative independent tax experts. It made the tax code more progressive Now, the fact is, what we offered, Senator Coates and Senator Gregg and I, was an actual bill. It was the product of weeks and months of work. Senator Gregg and I think it's fair to say, not all senators may not be aware of this, Senator Gregg was a top economic thinker who the majority leader consulted with. We sat next to each other for months in order to put together what is still the first and only comprehensive federal bipartisan tax reform plan since 1986. It was an actual bill. It wasn't 4 pages of rhetoric. You know, in the spring we got 1 page, Mr. President. I said it was shorter than your typical drugstore receipt. Now I guess we're up to 4 when you take out all the kind of, white space. But our bill, an actual bill, was designed to give everybody in America a chance to get ahead. Not just those in the 1%, not just those who have real clout and power. Now, I've always said, Mr. President, and this, again, is the heart of the difference. We have 2 tax codes in America. We have one for the cop and the nurse, and it is compulsory. Their taxes come right out, of their paychecks. No Cayman Islands deal for them. And then we have another tax code for the high flyers, the fortunate and the well-connected. They can pretty much pay what they want when they want to. The bipartisan proposal that I wrote with Senator Gregg and Senator Coates helped the first group, the cops and the nurses, but was also fair to everybody, gave everybody a chance to get ahead. The Republican plan is another big gift to that second group, the group that can decide what they're going to pay in taxes and when they're going to pay it. So you really couldn't have 2 proposals that are more different. The fact is, the Republican framework looks less like a real effort at tax reform than a shameless attempt to, in effect, accommodate the president's boast about the biggest tax cuts ever. Bottom line, it's a giveaway to those at the top, and it robs from the middle class. And the differences don't just end with these specifics that I have described here, Mr. President. We took a fundamentally different, approach. With Senator Gregg and Senator Coates, we were digging into the cobwebs of every dark corner of the tax code. We brought together principles that both sides had to find common ground. A lot of sweat equity. If you're going to write a partisan bill, you can go off on your own and do your thing. And the fact is, if Senators Gregg and Coates and I had written separate bills on our own, they would have looked very different. But the bill we wrote together, starting with Senator Gregg and I, was the first comprehensive bipartisan tax reform proposal in a quarter century. And Senator Coates, to his credit, did yeoman work in updating it. There is no comparison from a process standpoint, Mr. President, to that bipartisan work that was done to update the system of more than a quarter century ago and the Republican tax cut framework. The majority leader said from day one, the beginning of the year, that he didn't want Democratic input on tax reform. He said, we're just going to do it on the our way or the highway approach, reconciliation. Reconciliation is a rejection of bipartisanship through and through. Mr. President, I note that the President of the Senate is the tallest member of the Senate, I think, along with Senator Strange. And I talk fairly frequently to our former colleague, Senator Bradley, who was another tall Democrat on the Finance Committee with a much better jump shot than me. And he's described the bipartisan efforts of 1986, where key officials in President Reagan's administration, Jim Baker and Don Regan, they spent months talking to Democrats, months and months before anything happened. That's not what happened here. So the specifics are very different, and the process is very different. Now, recently, my Democratic colleagues and I came forward with our principles for reform, and it was just a matter of a few hours before Leader McConnell rejected them in the media. One administration official actually said the tax reform would be worse if it included Democratic ideas, and that go-it-alone mentality is pretty obvious when you look at the framework that came out last week. The tough questions haven't been answered. For those at the top, it's all sweet and no sour. There was not a single shred of Democratic input in the framework, not one Democratic fingerprint anywhere to be found. And the administration officials in charge of selling it to the public are, in my view, executing a con job on the middle class. So, Mr. President, I wanted to come here today to highlight some of the recent comments that the Senate Democratic leader has made with respect to some of these out-of-touch comments we've heard recently from key administration officials like Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin. And I wanted to make sure that senators heard, after the comments of the Senate Republican whip, that they now know that there is no comparison, none, between the bipartisan proposals that I had the honor to write with Senators Coates and Gregg that brought the two parties together, and the framework that came out last week that forced even more polarization between the parties. You know, the reality, Mr. President, this Republican proposal, this tax cut framework, is so radically skewed toward the wealthy and the big corporations, it makes Ronald Reagan's landmark reform look like the work of rabid socialists. So I have appreciated the chance to set the record straight here by outlining the differences between a bipartisan bill, a recent bipartisan bill with two influential, Republican senators that I had the honor to work with, and the extreme Republican framework that came out last week. These plans are not just trillions of dollars apart. Based on the numbers, it's clear that they're written with entirely different goals in mind. Our view is that tax reform ought to be about giving everybody in America the opportunity to get ahead. And what we've said is, instead of it being our way or the highway partisan approach, we ought to be doing what, particularly in the area of tax reform, has a storied history. The key to a successful tax reform based on that history is working in a bipartisan way. And I'll just close, Mr. President. There's been comment about the Democratic principles, which is we're not going to get the relief to people at the 1%. We're not going to break the bank. We're going to focus on the middle class. Mr. President, those principles don't even go as far as ideas advanced by President Reagan, where he said we're going to treat income from a wage and income from investment in the same way. So I close by way of saying, Mr. President, one, the distinguished Republican whip is wrong when he compares the bipartisan bill I've been part of to what the administration's tax framework is all about. And two, the right way to do this is to focus in a bipartisan way, not through partisanship only, and the principles that we have outlined on our side, when you compare them, do not even go as far as some of the ideas embraced by the late President Reagan. President, I yield the floor.